Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment. But in the past, everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier. Whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that. And eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. Although there is a version of this that can be hosted in the cloud known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'm not getting into that right now. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load, these machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you know, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now, the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands machines, and it's going to, you know, authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it, and that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where, you know, every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, group policy objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO. But what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate. So when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines authenticate with which domain controller. All right. So these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here, all right? And of course, you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular. by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these, these 4 servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right. So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'll give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's going to be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right, and so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right. And so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power, but here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL, and when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody It's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's the a small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that that can expand across multiple machines across the the board in these big data centers, but not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is, and with that is really where cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. Now, with the creation of virtualization, this got companies thinking, if we can emulate hardware, we can create these virtual machines, and we can store software on there. We can have operating systems running on that emulated hardware, the operating systems being called guest operating systems. We could technically host these virtual machines for companies for a price as a service. So the idea being, hey, you pay us a fee each month and we'll host your virtual servers, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of hosting your own data center on premise, and the power that's needed to do that, and the air conditioning that's needed to do that, all the hardware that's needed to do that, as well as the knowledge of how all the hardware works. So this is essentially what a cloud company brings to the table. So various companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, a lot of them already had tons of data centers, these big massive warehouses all over the world that they could support it. Some of these companies, such as Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, and Amazon being one of the biggest and first, decided to open this up to the public for a fee and allow you to host your services in their data centers. So this is where cloud computing really comes into place. This big cloud here is going to represent cloud computing, mainly the Microsoft cloud computing. And of course it's all connected to the internet with incredibly fast, high-speed internet connections, fiber connections, and all of that. So there's some terminology or some acronyms I want to talk a little bit about real fast here as we get into this. First off, in cloud computing there is an acronym we call IaaS. That stands for Infrastructure as a Service. Okay? Infrastructure as a service means that a provider is hosting all of the hardware infrastructure for you, and then they are going to provide you with a way for you to interact with that hardware and utilize their hardware as a service. All right, and this of course is where Azure comes into play, Microsoft Azure. Now, you might pronounce that word different. People have different ways of saying Azure. Some people call it Azure, some people call it Azure, some people call it, I've even heard it called Azure before, Azure. There's various names for it. In fact, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I decided I wanted to make sure I was pronouncing this correctly. So I was like, I'm going to go to watch the developers. So I started watching videos of the developers, the people who created Azure, and I figured I would determine. The very first video I ever watched, the guy was pronouncing the word Azure, so that's how I say it. But what I further learned is that the Microsoft developers don't agree on how to say it either. Some of them say Azure, some of them call it Azure, some of them call it Azure. So anyway, tomato, tomato, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, okay? But Azure is Microsoft's main IaaS system. What this is Microsoft is going to host, they've got all these data centers all over the world, and they're going to host their hardware so that you can host on top of their hardware your virtual machines or whatever it is. So you can host virtual machines. Microsoft will also allow you to have access to what are called virtual appliances, like virtual firewalls, also virtual load balancing software, because you can get access to what are called VNets, This is virtual networking, so you can create these virtual networks based on TCP/IP that are running your, in their cloud service with virtual machines on it, and then you can put a virtual firewall. So you can almost like recreate what you're seeing here in an on-premise environment. You can recreate that in the cloud. They also provide virtual storage, so you can store data and backup data out there. They support database hosting, all of that. That's all part of IaaS. Now with IaaS, the model for that, for the most part, is you pay for what you use. So there's an algorithm that looks at how much memory, how much processing power, how much storage that's being used, and then you get a fee each month for what you're using. The good news is they do have a calculator that kind of helps you forecast this. And you can even set alarms to let you know if you're approaching a certain budget that you've got on cost. There's a lot of things out there to help you do that. But that's the idea. You pay for what you use. Okay, now there is another couple of terms I want to mention as well. This next term is called Platform as a Service, and then there's a third term called Software as a Service. So Platform as a Service, PaaS, and Software as a Service. Platform as a Service and software. Let me explain software as a service first, because it's pretty easy to visualize, and then I'll explain platform as a service. So the idea of software as a service is basically they have applications that can be hosted in the cloud service, apps, if you will. These apps are 100% ready to use, ready for you to take advantage of. All you got to do is use those applications. Okay. For example, Microsoft has what's called Office for the web, or it used to be called Office Online. So that's like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run it from within your web browser. All you got to do is just jump right in and use it. So from an admin standpoint, all we have to do is assign the users that are allowed to use that, and they can go use it, and it's available to them 100%. All they got to do is start using it. There's not really a lot of administration for us. Now, what is Platform as a Service? Well, Platform as a Service is a system in which the majority of the configuration is done for us, but we still have some admin configuration we have to do to use it. For example, with virtual machines, this is 100% IaaS. A virtual machine you can put whatever operating system on there, but you're responsible for the operating system. You're responsible for the software that goes on it. You as an admin have to manage all that. Okay. With Platform as a Service, virtual machines are set up in the background that you don't have any control over. They've already put the operating system on there. They've already put the software on there. You don't have any control over any of that. But there's still some administration you have to do in order to control it. For example, Microsoft has a directory service called Azure AD. Now, this is a big deal. This is probably one of the biggest deals of the things I've gone over so far in this cloud. Azure Active Directory is what we call a platform as a service. It is a directory service that is sort of the cloud version of what you have here called ADDS. So, now I remember when I first heard about Azure Active Directory, I thought, oh, well, this is just like you're just hosting virtual domain controllers in the cloud. No, they have completely redone the concepts of Active Directory. It is completely redone with all new web-based programming languages. It does not use any of the dated stuff like LDAP and Kerberos and all that. It uses industry standard authentication protocols in order to support all the latest and greatest features and capabilities in the cloud. Okay, and so these are where users, passwords, all of that stuff is going to be managed in the cloud. But it starts out with almost nothing in it. So it's ready to use, but you as an admin have to start creating users and all of that. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I want to use my on-premise users in the cloud? Well, stand by, I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Azure AD is a platform as a service. So is, here's another one, Exchange Online. Microsoft has Exchange Online. That is actually both a platform as a service and a software as a service, in that the admin side of it is the platform as a service, but the user side is the software as a service. Same thing for SharePoint Online. Microsoft has SharePoint Online as well. Same idea there. All right. And then you've got Microsoft Teams. That's the admin side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service. There is OneDrive for Business. That's a cloud storage that we have access to that allows users to store their data out there in the cloud. There is a product called Intune, which is Microsoft's MDM product. MDM, it's also MAM product, so it's both. Mobile device management, that allows us to manage devices. This is one of the most powerful things we have available to us. This is what sort of is replacing the concept of GPOs. This is going to allow us to manage our device settings. Not only can we manage on-premise devices, but we can manage mobile devices. GPOs can only manage devices for Windows. With Intune, we can manage Windows, Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all that stuff. With the help of Intune, we can manage the settings and restrictions. We can deploy software. This is a very, very powerful product, okay, that we have available to us. It even has a thing called Autopilot, which will allow us to reconfigure Windows machines and all of that. So very, very powerful stuff that we have available to us. All right. Now, I will tell you that Azure has, Azure definitely has some of the, it has some platform as a service technologies and some software as a services technologies, but the main type of system that Microsoft has created for platform as a service and software as a service is called Microsoft 365. Okay, Microsoft 365. All right, which I forgot to add to my display here. We actually do have apps that are called the Microsoft 365 apps. All right, which formerly they would call them Office 365 apps. They're now, starting to call them Microsoft 365 apps. But the Microsoft 365 services it is a cloud service that basically sits on top of Azure. So you have Azure in the background of all this, and the Microsoft 365 sitting on top of it. All right, you can't have a Microsoft 365 account or tenant that doesn't also have Azure. Azure is in the background no matter what. And the other thing to be aware of is both of these share Azure AD. So you'll notice that there are web portals for creating users and things through Microsoft 365 or creating users through Azure. It all ties back to Azure AD. You're going to see the same users no matter what. So these two things are glued together basically. Okay, they're glued together. Now on Microsoft 365 with PaaS and SaaS and all that, you're not really going to be hosting virtual machines, but you're going to be working with these services. Let's just kind of color code some of this real quick. All right. Now again, I do want to add that Azure does have PaaS and SaaS services that I'm not getting into right now, but it's mainly an IaaS based service. That's its main focus. Microsoft 365 is strictly PaaS related and software as a service, SaaS related. It doesn't really have any virtual machines or any of that, though it can interact with them. Okay, so if I was to sort of draw a circle around some of these, all of this stuff you see here would be Azure related, and then all of this stuff you see right here would be the Microsoft 365 related. Now, they both share Azure AD, so I'm going to put a purple circle around that. Red and blue make purple. All right, and so they all link to that. Okay, and so that is how Microsoft handles those concepts. The other thing about With Azure, you're paying for the CPU, RAM, storage you use. With Microsoft 365, it's all based on licenses. So you purchase these subscriptions that have a certain amount of licenses, and you issue these licenses out to your users, and your users can take advantage of these various features. Okay. One more thing I want to explain here, and that is, what about the issue of what if we want to use our on-premise users to access resources in Azure? Well, Microsoft has a solution for that. They actually have a type of server that you can set up, and the server is called an Azure AD Connect server. Azure AD Connect. Now, what does this do? An Azure AD Connect server, this is a synchronization-based system, and what it will do is it will allow my on-premise users to be synchronized out to Azure AD. Now, it does not allow Azure AD users to be synced in, only out, but it will allow user passwords and all of that to be synced in. So if a user is logging on to Azure AD and they change their password out in the cloud, it does have the ability to synchronize that password back in. But the beauty of this is by going this route, if you have this on-premise environment, you can achieve what we call SSO. What is SSO? Single sign-on. The idea of single sign-on with all of this is my user can sit down at their on-premise computer, they can log on, and it's going to log them on both in the cloud as well, it's going to log them on-premise as well as in the cloud at the same time. All right, and they can access resources out there. The other thing I'll tell you is that Microsoft has moved into a way to where you could technically not even have a domain nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a domain. In fact, it pains me to say this as a consultant because, I have fed my family for, 2 decades by using Active Directory, both teaching it as well as, consulting on it. But I'll be honest, Microsoft is now moving in a direction to where domains are not even needed anymore. They're now making it possible to where everything can be managed through your cloud service and domains are not needed. But if you're a company that's already got a domain and all this is still in place and all of that, then this Azure AD Connect server is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully this has now helped you have a better understanding. This was really just a fundamentals video to help you understand the cloud service, the concepts of it, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Let's talk about the concept of tenants involving Azure and the Microsoft 365 services. So first things first, if you think about the idea of cloud services, you are a tenant of somebody else's environment. In fact, I always thought there's a funny t-shirt I've seen out there that it says there is no cloud, only somebody else's computer. And it's very true, right? Like when we are hosting things in the cloud, we are hosting our virtual machines or our data or whatever it is. We're actually hosting it on somebody else's hardware, right, in these data centers. So we are a tenant of that environment. It's kind of like if you live in an apartment complex and that apartment complex has maybe a pond and a little park that you can walk around or walk your dog or, playground for the kids, maybe a swimming pool. Those are amenities that apartment is allowing its tenants to have access to, right? If you are a tenant at that apartment complex, you get access to the amenities. So this is the idea with the cloud services as you are a tenant of these cloud services, you are allowed to have access to certain amenities that are available to you. Of course, with Microsoft 365, there are certain things that are included. With Azure AD, there are certain things that are included. It all ties together. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, hopefully, if you are wanting to do hands-on, you went through and you created a subscription in my videos about setting up for hands-on. and so you know how to create a subscription to Microsoft 365 and Azure AD. Okay, again, you can't really have Microsoft 365 without having Azure AD. It's just part of the deal. Azure AD is actually free. There's a free version of it, but you can activate different licenses for it. And the more licenses you have, the more capabilities and features you have. Though I'm not going to get deep into that right now. I do want to show you Microsoft's definition of what a tenant is. So actually, if you do a Google search or Bing search on what a tenant is for Azure, you'll come across this article here: subscription license accounts, tenants for Microsoft's cloud offerings. And if we scroll down a little bit, Microsoft tells you that an Azure AD tenant is a specific instance of Azure AD containing accounts and groups, paid or trial subscriptions of Microsoft 365 or Dynamics 365 include a free Azure AD tenant as well. So again, when you sign up for those, you get Azure AD because it all, the directory service is all tied back to Azure AD. The Azure AD tenant does not include other Azure services and is not the same as Azure trial or paid. Now, what are they talking about there? Well, if you want to start hosting virtual machines, you have to set up a subscription to do that. Now, not really getting into that right now. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. We do have an Azure AD tenant. In my case, if I click right here and I go to the menu button and I go to Azure Active Directory, I can see that my name, Exam Lab Practice, and my tenant ID, everybody gets a unique tenant ID, all right? And that is my tenant. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Back in the on-premise world with domains, the way we've had things for years is you could have multiple domains, and one of the reasons for having multiple domains is to subdivide your environment up by country. Sometimes we'd have multiple domains because we had maybe our company was owned by another company, or we owned another company, or we're part of a bigger organization. I worked for a company in the early 2000s that they were a smaller company that was owned by a much bigger company, and this bigger company owned like 10 different companies. So you can imagine, a situation like that where you are part of a bigger organization, but you have multiple companies and they each need their own services to manage. Well, this is perfect for Azure tenants because we could have different tenants for the different companies of our organization. So we can actually go right here to Manage Tenants. And you can see I only have one tenant right now. That's this Exam Lab Practice one. But I can click to create a tenant. And then from there I can choose, am I creating a tenant, Azure AD tenant for myself? Is this going to be a B2C, which is a business to customer? If you click on Learn More right here too, they'll break it down for you a little bit. In fact, they talk a little bit about the Azure AD licenses. There is a free version of Azure AD. You can create users and groups, and they tell you do directory synchronization with on-premise and self-service password management. And then there's Premium, which allows you to support hybrid users, access both on-premise cloud resources, has advanced administration, dynamic groups, self-service groups, manage Microsoft Identity Management, cloud write-back capabilities to the on-premise world, self-service password reset for your on-premise users. Then you got Premium 2, step up, you get some more advanced security features like the privileged identity management, conditional access, so you get just-in-time administration. And I do realize that at this point you may not know what all that means, but just understand that these are more powerful features. And then of course the business to customer pay-as-you-go feature. This is if you were a provider who is providing access to Azure AD to perhaps a customer of some sort, customer-facing apps. Maybe you're a service provider for some kind of a web-based app, and you have customers that pay you for this web-based app that you've got, and you need a version of Azure AD just for that customer. So this is something you could do as well. All right. Anyway, if I select this, I can click Next, and then I can give it a name. Whatever this whatever this other organization is, right? It could be called something like ABC Corporation, which I'm just making something up there, right? And then if I want to specify the domain name, let's say ABC Corporation .onmicrosoft.com, then I could do that. Of course, the name's already taken like it is here, then obviously, I'm going to put the number 1000 after it. There we go. So it's obvious that name is not taken. Now, of course, it doesn't really matter. Once you register that name with Microsoft, that's just to create the tenant, and then you can actually create a custom domain name to go with that. So if I really did own the name abccorporation.com or something, I could associate that with it later. Okay. At that point, I would click Review and Create, and then I would click Create. I'm not going to create this tenant right now. I just wanted to show you how you could do it. And at that point, when you have multiple tenants, you can actually switch as an admin. You'll be an admin of both. You can switch back and forth by clicking this little switch button. Okay, so that is the idea of creating a tenant. And of course, here's the thing. If you do that, though, you're going to have separate subscriptions for your Microsoft 365 side of things. So you'll have to have separate subscriptions for all that. So really, the thing you want to remember here is creating multiple tenants isn't really a common scenario for most organizations. It is for some, especially if they have multiple companies that they own. But for the most part, if you're unless you're a service provider providing some kind of web-based application or something, but for the most part, this is not something that a lot of companies are going to do. They're not going to have lots and lots of different tenants. So, but it is important to at least understand the idea of a tenant and the fact that you can create multiple tenants in utilization with Azure AD and Microsoft 365. I now want to talk about implementing and managing domains for our Microsoft 365 and Azure tenant. All right. So when it comes to domain names, you are given a temporary name when you first sign up for your subscription for Azure and Microsoft 365. When you set your tenant up, you are given a domain name called a .onmicrosoft.com name. All right, so that is your original name, but of course, if we're going to be managing email and services and all that, we want our service name, our tenant name, to be known as a custom domain name of our choosing, usually based on what we use as our web presence and all that. For example, my web presence is examlabpractice.com, and maybe I want all of my services associated with that name. Maybe I want to be able to manage email and all of that through that. Then I need to set that custom domain up here in the Microsoft 365 services in order to make all that work. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the first thing you got to do is you've got to purchase a domain name. Now I use GoDaddy, and some people like GoDaddy, some people don't like GoDaddy, and I've used GoDaddy for probably 14 or 15 years. So I've been with them so long, I've just kind of stuck with them. But you can register domain names through anybody, or through any of the different registrar companies that are out there. And so how do I go about doing that? Well, I'll just show you an example of GoDaddy here. Here's GoDaddy, all right? I can choose a name that I want to register, right? Now, if you're just wanting to play around, you could register a name, and it's very cheap. Especially if you do like a name like a .live or something. Those names are currently very cheap. They have some names that are just like 99 cents, like a .store name, for example. If you're just wanting to play around, then that's a great way to do it, right? But if I was gonna, let's say my name is, well, let's say I was gonna register that name, examlabpractice.store, right? I could search that, see if the name's available, and then obviously I could purchase the name, and then at that point we've got to register that name with on the Microsoft service side. Okay, so let's go back, and I'll come back to that in a second. if I go right here under settings, this is portal.microsoft.com. If I go under settings and I go down to domains, you can see that I've actually already registered my domain names, but I'm showing you the process anyway here. That was my original name right here, and then what I did is I registered my examlabpractice.com name, and that became my default. I set that as my primary. Okay, so that's how that worked. Looks like this is probably just locked up, so let's try refreshing. Let's try this again. See if it goes a little quicker this time. Okay, it didn't like that I was doing it in private mode apparently. So anyway, you can, it says make it yours. Now you do have to be careful when you go to purchase these names, because what ends up happening is they try to stack on all these different things that you don't need. So just if you decide to go through and purchase a name, just make sure that you don't agree to all the other services that they want you to agree to. And you can get it, they'll tell you the first year for 99 cents. And definitely something you can play around with. You can't use the same name as me, obviously. So if you are doing hands-on and all that, it's probably a good idea for you to come up with your own naming convention and all that stuff. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Whatever you want your name to be here, that would be my advice. So what happens once I've registered that name? Well, here is, you go into your DNS records for that name in GoDaddy. In this case, GoDaddy. I'm using GoDaddy, and I would need to add a record. Now let me show you what I mean by I got to add a record. Let's jump back into. Let's go back over here to portal.microsoft.com. All right, and we're going to go back to settings and then domains. And so what we would do is we would add a domain name. Okay, now if I really bought examlabpractice.store, okay, I'd say use the domain. Okay, and then now it's going to get me to verify that I actually own that name. All right, so I would add a text record to this domain's DNS record, basically. That's the first option. The second option is, if you can't add a text record, you can add an MX record. That's a mail exchange record. And another option is, if you've already set up a website, it'll give you a little file, and you just store that little file in the root of the website folder, and it'll verify it that way. So if I say add a text record to the domain, I would click continue, and then I'm going to copy this data right here. It's basically like a one-time code, and I would copy that data right there, and I would jump back over here, right here, and I would add a text record. All right, you can just put the @ symbol for that, and then you would paste that in right there. Okay, and then I would hit save. All right, and it would create that record. Now once that record's created, I would jump back over here and I would click verify. Now I didn't really buy that name, so obviously if I verify, it's not going to really verify. But if I did own that name, it would have worked, right? It would have verified. Okay, and so then at that point, let's go back over here to domains. I would have that domain name, and I could make it my primary. And again, just I wouldn't have all this other stuff if this was my primary domain name. So at that point, I'd make it my primary, and it would also be reflected on the Azure side of things as well. In fact, if we go over to portal.azure.com, Azure lets you register it too. So you go to the menu button, you go to Azure Active Directory. I could have done it this way too. So go here, and then there is a custom domain names blade. So I could click on that, and look at there. So there's that same name. I could have done it this way too. So it's all tied together anyway, right? It's all tied together. So that's how you can add that custom domain name. Now, I do want to talk, I want to jump over and into my drawing for just a moment, because I do want to point something out. If you were hosting a DNS publicly as opposed to using somebody like GoDaddy. I was talking about doing it through GoDaddy, but you could technically, if your company was hosting a public DNS, then you would do it that way. So let me jump in and show you that. So if this was your scenario and you had an actual domain like this here, and you weren't using, you could register it with GoDaddy, but you would also have to set up an internet-facing DNS server. This DNS server right here, though this DNS server is hosting the name for the internal side, it is not an internet-facing DNS server, nor do you want this server to be an internet-facing DNS server. So that's what GoDaddy is doing. GoDaddy is an internet-facing DNS server. They provide internet-facing DNS services. But if you just wanted to do it yourself, then the way that we traditionally did that in the real world is we would host a DNS server out on the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. All right, and it would have the same name, examlabpractice.com, or in the case of if I purchased the name store and wasn't using the .com name, then it would be .store, right? But let's just try to fit that in best I can here. Well, I think what I'm going to have to do, because I just don't have a lot of room, is we'll just put that, we'll put that right here underneath it. Okay, and then maybe I'll put a blue border around that real quick, and we'll just paste that blue. This is just to show that even though these names are the same, this is the internet-facing DNS server. This is a private DNS server managing the domain DNS. So at that point, you would do the same thing. If this was like a Microsoft DNS server, you can create a text record. You would have to when you register the name through GoDaddy or somebody like that, you would have to tell GoDaddy to use the IP address of your DNS server. But at that point, anytime somebody queries this name from the internet, it's going to hit this DNS server. So you'd have to create the text record there. Okay, you're not going to be doing that in your lab environment or any of that. So I wouldn't attempt to try to set that up in your lab environment. You'd have to have a public address associated with it and all that. I'm just saying that this is how some companies do it. It's not very common these days. A lot of people are using for their websites, they're using internet-facing DNS hosting companies like GoDaddy. But it is a possibility. It is a way to handle it. All right. So hopefully that now helps you understand the idea of managing domains in the Microsoft 365 and Azure AD services. Now I want to show you one more quick thing involving our domain name. If we go over to portal.microsoft.com, go to domains, whenever you've registered a domain name, the next thing you think about with this is the fact that maybe you're wanting to manage Exchange Online and all of that stuff so that you can check your email, and you want to support your custom domain name with Teams and some of the various services. So when you click on a name that you've registered, there's a continue setup option, and it's going to walk you through basically creating the records that are needed to be supported for things like Microsoft Exchange. So they mentioned right here Exchange and Exchange Online Protection. You're going to need this record created. You're going to need this record created. You're going to need this record. So basically you just jump over to GoDaddy or wherever that you whatever you registered, and you just create those records. So again, all I got to do is just come right over here and click Add Record, and I'm going to create the records that they're telling me that need to be created here. Once you've done that, you'll be able to, it'll tell you that everything's completed and everything's healthy. And if I click on it, I'll be able to click this DNS Records tab, and I can see that these records have been created. Okay, so and of course, if you still got for backwards compatibility for Skype for Business and all that, granted, they've deprecated all that nowadays, but for Exchange and Teams and all that, you got to have these additional records if you want things to properly work. Okay, but that little walkthrough that they got is very easy. There's also, if you do a quick Google search on Google or Bing, do a quick Google search on DNS records to connect your domain. They have this article. This is the same thing I just showed you, registering your domain name and then creating these records step by step. Okay, so it's actually very straightforward. You just gotta register the domain name and then follow the directions. I'd like to now take a look at some of our organizational settings that we have here in Microsoft 365. So here we are on portal.microsoft.com. Going to go over to the settings drop-down blade and we will go to org settings. And so from there we start out on services. Now what this does is Microsoft 365 is able to detect which services that you have available to you based on the licenses and all of that you have. And as you scroll down, you can click these various links and it'll take you straight to more settings that can be configured related to that service. So for example, I just clicked on the Microsoft 365 on the web, which if you're not familiar with that, that's basically an online version of the Microsoft 365 apps like Word Online and Excel Online and all of that. So it tells you here to choose to allow users to open certain external files. If you want to allow certain external files, it says let users open files stored in third-party storage services in Microsoft 365. So by having this checked, I'm going to allow that. If I wanted to turn it off, I could. So the point is, as you can see here, is each one of these you can click on, like here's Microsoft Teams, and there can be various settings that can be turned on or turned off for each one of those types of services. Okay, so you can definitely go through here and look and see what's available. There's lots and lots and lots of services. Obviously you don't need to memorize all these services right now, but it is important to be aware of the fact that there are certain things that I might want to turn on or turn off for the whole organization related to that specific service. Okay, so like Sway here, they tell you this is for, Sway makes it easier for sharing, interacting, personal storage, presentation, newsletters. When you check any of these boxes here, you're setting this for the whole organization. So this isn't just for one individual person, this is the whole organization. That's the one thing I need you to take away from this, is that org settings is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's organization settings. All right. And so these settings are for all these various services that you see here for the whole organization. The next thing we've got is security and privacy. So with security and privacy, as you can probably imagine based on its name, this is going to be related to org settings involving security and of course the privacy policies and settings that we have. So for example, you have Bing data collection. Choose whether you're going to whether Bing can learn for your organization. If you don't want Bing searching information, you can take that off. You have customer lockbox. So provide additional security by requiring approvals through lockbox email requests and access to data for your organization. This will not going to get deep into this, but this, in a nutshell, this involves Microsoft support. And if you ever have to call Microsoft support for any reason and they need to get access to some data that for some reason you don't have access to, maybe you got locked out, then there's a thing called lockbox, which means that there's an additional layer of security. In a nutshell, I'll say this also, that Microsoft has a group of people. Any support person at Microsoft must go through a group of people to get approval to even touch your Microsoft tenant. So if you are locked out or you do have a problem, before they can do anything, they have to get approval from a group of people at Microsoft. But this is adding an additional layer of protection by requiring email approval. So then we have idle session timeout. If somebody's idle, obviously you can make it where users automatically get out of their web apps after a period of time. If they're not using their web apps or whatever, they get logged out, right? So that's the idea. So idle session timeout signs users automatically out of their apps. And then you got password expiration policy. You can have passwords expire at a certain time. So this policy you choose here applies to everyone in your organization. Set passwords never to expire. This is the default. It used to always be that we'd want passwords to expire and users to have to change passwords every couple of weeks, but with the help of multi-factor authentication and all that, it doesn't really improve your security a whole lot. So then privacy profile, you can have this, specify a privacy statement that you want people to see in your environment. You can do that. Privilege access. So they tell you here this is a way for people in your organization to provide tasks that would otherwise require a higher level of permission or an admin role. So when somebody submits a request to the access privilege task, the default approval group, you can choose, you choose can approve or deny that if you want. So I could allow privilege access requests and choose default approval if I want by selecting this, and then I can specify a group that's based on that. All right. Then I can allow pronouns. Users can put pronouns in their profile. I have self-service password reset. Not getting in a lot of depth on that right now, but that involves users being able to reset their passwords if they need to. And then you got sharing, control access for sharing information outside the organization. So like this will involve things like guests. If a user is sharing a document with somebody that doesn't actually have an account in our environment, like they're a guest user, this is going to control some settings on that. So this is let users and new guests support this. So by default, it is going to be supported. Keep in mind that usually the way that works is even if you turn it on at the organizational level like this, you can still go into the application itself. So for example, take Microsoft Teams. I could go into Microsoft Teams and I could control which users can do that if I want. So there is a more granular level of control that way. The last thing I'll show you here is just organizational profile. Pretty simple idea here. This is just going to let you customize your organizational information. So I can have custom app launcher tiles. Tells you that create custom tiles that will appear in the all apps section of Office 365 app launcher for all your users. Users can pin custom tiles. So you have custom tiles, you have custom themes. So if you want to set a custom theme for your organization, no color, graphics, all that. So all these various things, that's what that's going to involve. You know, help desk information, if you want to supply some help desk information for users if they need help. Keyboard shortcuts, organization information, I can plug, you know, information about my organization. Release preferences. This gets into, you know, choose how your organization gets new features and service updates from Office 365. Right now it's standard. So your entire organization gets updates when we release them broadly, or I could do targeted, release to everyone. Your entire organization gets updates early, or targeted release for select users. So you can pick like the IT people to get updates a little earlier for all of this. So that's the idea there. Send email notifications from your domain. This lets Microsoft send notification messages from the email address within your organization instead of a Microsoft email address. And then finally, support integration. Integrate your internal support tools. There are you know, certain capabilities there that we could utilize involving our own support services. We could use our own support tool and you know, integrate this into the Microsoft support integration. Of course, not everything's supported, but you can click that Learn More link to see all the supported capabilities you can use there. All right, so that is the idea of these three items. I wouldn't stress over like having to memorize all of these or anything like that, but it is important to remember that these are org settings, so what you set here will affect your entire Microsoft 365 and Azure AD tenant organization. One of the things we have to consider when working with any cloud service is that sometimes when things go wrong, well, it's not on our side, it's on the cloud services side. I know for me, usually when I run into some kind of a problem, I tend to want to think, oh, I'm doing something wrong, I've configured something wrong on my side or something like that. But ultimately, it could be on the cloud service provider side, in this case Microsoft. It could be on their side. Well, the good news is Microsoft does provide us with a service health center that we can go to that will show us if Microsoft is experiencing any issues right now with their service. So let me show you how to do that. Here we are on portal.microsoft.com. I'm going to click the show all ellipse symbol here, and then I'm going to scroll down to you see this little heart symbol, and then I'm going to click the little drop down blade called health, and we're going to click on dashboard. And so here we are on the health dashboard. It's going to let us know right out of the gates if there's any big issues. Right now there's nothing going on. It says everything is healthy. Although my Exchange Online is showing 6 advisories, so we can click on that, and you can see it says admins may see some mailbox migrations. Let's click on that a little deeper and we can read it. So admins may see some mailbox migrations to Exchange Online fail to complete and restart. Says the user impact. Notice it gives me update information. So this is one of the really neat things about it. Even though nothing's really broken right now, there's not a lot of errors, they are warning you that there is a couple of advisories, a couple things to be aware of that certain users might experience. It tells you what the impact is, it tells you what the scope of the problem is, start time, and as time goes on, as Microsoft updates the problem, you get a log of all of the messages that they've released as far as fixing the issue. So this is a pretty neat concept, pretty neat feature. We can click on any of these and look at each one and get more information if we want. All right. We can also click on View All in Service Health. That's basically going to bring us over here. And so here are all the various health issues. You'll see these are all related to Microsoft Exchange Online. And then right here you got Microsoft 365 Defender. Again, you can click on those just like you saw, and you can see who it's going to affect, and you can see the various pieces of information that's available here. All right. So from there, I've got some other options that are available to me regarding service health. If I wanted to report an issue, I could. So I could click on report, and it says, is this causing a significant impact to your business? I can say yes. Which product is it? We'll say Teams. Select the issue. Maybe users can't share files, right? So then we would go in here and give a description. We could also click other and give a description if it's not listed. So anyway, this is how you can report things to Microsoft. You can also look at issue history. Here's all the issue history Microsoft has had. Right here, this is a problem that was happening with Microsoft 365 Suite. You can see that the service is restored now, so users shouldn't be experiencing this issue anymore. Okay, so very neat. That was just the past 7 days. I could go past 30 days if I want and see all the issues in the last 30 days. So you never know. You could have been on vacation last week and a user sent you an email saying, hey, I've got a problem, I can't do this, I can't do that. Well, it could have been related to the service, and then you could come in here and see if that problem has already been fixed. Here's where you can look at reported issues. So this is if I report any issues, that's where that's going to show up. Okay. So this service health area is very helpful. It lets me keep track of what's going on. I can even customize certain things I want to look at and not look at by clicking customize. You can see maybe I don't care anything about Power BI or Power Apps. Then I could obviously click turn those off and click save. All right. But that is the Service Health dashboard, Service Health settings. As you can see, pretty easy to use and definitely can help you with researching problems that you might be experiencing in your Microsoft 365 services. Now, of course, if Microsoft experiences issues on their side with their cloud services, it would be helpful if we could receive an email notification letting us know that they're experiencing a problem. It's helpful as an admin. Maybe I come into work every morning, get my cup of coffee, I can sit down and check my email, and I can see that there's been a notification that's come in that says, hey, we're experiencing a problem with Exchange or Teams or whatever it may be. Or maybe that happens halfway through the day. It's great if you're kind of like I am and you're constantly checking your email to get these notifications, because you're probably not going to come in here all the time and check this. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If I click on portal.microsoft.com, or I go to portal.microsoft.com, click Show All, go down to the Health drop down, and then we'll click on Service Health. And if I go over here to Customize, there is a email tab I can click on where I can say send me email notifications about Service Health. So I could put in my email address. It tells you can enter up to 2 email addresses separated by a semicolon, and you can specify the things that you want to receive an email for. Okay, so that's a very easy way to stay updated on service health issues that Microsoft might be experiencing. So now for decades, companies have managed their services on premise, right? We've had Microsoft domains and we've set up servers and eventually virtual machines, but as time has gone on, Microsoft has began to adopt the whole cloud model for managing everything. And of course, they're pushing this heavily in our direction. So nowadays, lots and lots and lots of companies are moving to managing things in the cloud, which is, I'm assuming, the reason you're watching this video. But ultimately, it's important for us as admins to understand that sometimes there is a migration period where you're kind of in this weird in-between hybrid phase where, you know, some of your users are still doing things, you know, the on-premise way of doing it, and then some of them have moved into the cloud, and maybe we're slowly prodding our users to start using more of the cloud services instead of the older methods for managing things and doing things. So Microsoft does provide us with a way to look to see what the adoption is looking like of their service. When I say adoption, I mean the usage of it all, right? So I want to show you how we can look at that right now. Here we are on portal.microsoft.com, and if I click the show all ellipse symbol, and there's a little drop down here called reports, I'm going to click that, and there is a blade called adoption score. So I can click on that, and they tell you that this is going to provide insights to your organization's digital transformation journey through its use of the Microsoft 365 and technology experience. So basically they're saying, okay, well, you know, how many of your users are actually using this services that are available? We can turn this score on, and then it says adoption score provides insights. Your selection determines which users and groups will provide data to calculate. I could say just include it for everybody, or exclude specific users groups, or don't calculate for any users. I'm going to say include for all users, and at that point we will click save. All right. So we turn that on, right? If we refresh our web browser, you're going to be sorely disappointed. And the reason you're going to be sorely disappointed right when you turn that on is because it tells you that it can take up to 24 hours before insights are available. Please check back later. But the other thing we have is this blade called usage. All right. And they do tell you that the usage reports show how people in your business are using Microsoft 365 services. Reports are available for the last 7 days, 30 days, 90 days, 180 days. Data won't exist for all reporting periods right away. The report becomes available within 48 hours. So be advised, there's usually not a whole lot going on here until, you know, you actually generate some data. Right now in my little environment that I've got, it says I have one active user, and that active user has been using Outlook, and well, that's, you know, pretty much me. 23 files stored, 70 files stored for SharePoint, 23 for OneDrive, total number of activations. But anyway, as you can imagine, I could click through here and I could see the activity that's going on. So here's email activity that I can look at, forms activity, browser activity, project teams, Visio, Office 365. So you can see number of users here, product licenses, activations. Of course, you know, in this little lab environment, trial environment, there's not a lot going on. But if you do have access to your own company, your organization's and data, it's definitely something neat to see. You could jump in and take a look at it there. But I think you probably get the idea. This is the idea of adoption, being able to go in and look at these reports and see what the usage is of the Microsoft 365 services in our environment. I'd now like to show you how we can manage and create users inside of our Azure Active Directory environment. Now, to start with, I just wanted you to be aware that we're going to use the portal.azure.com method of doing this first, and then we'll jump over to the Microsoft 365 side, and we'll look at how we can create and manage users over there. Ultimately, they all end up in the same place, which is Azure AD. All right. So here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button here, and we're going to go down to the Azure Active Directory blade, and then from there we're going to click on users. Now be advised, you're going to see a lot of users in my little environment because I use this Azure Tenant to teach a lot of different courses with. So just ignore the fact that, you know, if you're doing this on your end, you're not going to have all the same users as me. That's not a big deal, all right? But here I am under users, and I want to click to create a new user. I'm going to click create new user, and then we would give the user name. And I'm just going to come up with some random names. I'm going to call this user Lucas Paulson, and that'll be at examlabpractice.com. Notice you could choose domain name here. And then display name, we'll say Lucas Paulson. And then, of course, we can set the password, or we can do an auto-generated password, which is what it's doing. Also, right now the account is going to be enabled, but if we did not want the account to be enabled, we could uncheck that box, and then at that point the account would not be enabled. The account would be disabled. All right. So, and of course, you know, you might do that in a scenario where maybe you've got a user that's going to be, you know, joining the company, you know, next week, and so we're just going to deactivate the account until it's time for the user to start. All right, so anyway, we're going to click next, and then you would just fill out the property information here if you wanted. All right. Member type, this user's a member as opposed to a guest. Specify job title, company, department, all this stuff. I'm not going to fill all this stuff out right now, but I will say there's one important key ingredient thing you want to do, and that is you want to specify a usage location. Now, the reason that is important is because you cannot assign this user any licenses for any products unless they have a usage location. If you try to assign a license to a user without doing usage location, you will get an error message. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to say United States, and we'll click next. And then if we wanted to assign what is called an administrative unit, we could. If we want to add a group, role, I'm not getting into any of that stuff right now, but this is where you could do that. From there, we would click next, review and create, and then at that point, we click create, and we've now created ourselves a user. So very easy, you know, very painless process to create a user. And we should be able to find that user in here. Here it is, Lucas Paulson. If we want to edit the user's properties, we can. We just click on Lucas Paulson, and then from there, if you want to change anything, you're going to click Edit Properties, and then you can change it from here. Now, let me warn you, this is yet another thing that's constantly changing. It feels like this interface changes like every week. So just be advised, it doesn't matter how many times I update my videos, it's like this changes, it feels like every week. So your screen could look a little different than mine. You know, it is what it is. It's constantly changing. But anyway, you can go through here and you can modify these various settings for this user if you wanted. These different pieces of information that you could have set, you could do that here. There's even parental controls here. Set what's called age group, consent, provide for minors. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but that's kind of neat. And then settings, and then also if this was on-premise related, which it's not, that would be here. Speaking of which, this account that we just created, Lucas Paulson, is what we call a cloud-only account. That means that it was created in the cloud. It is not an on-premise account. Now, if you have an on-premise domain and you set up the Azure AD Connect or Connect Sync, that's going to synchronize users out here to the cloud. All right, but it's not with Lucas Paulson. Is not going to be syncing, you know, back into on-premise or any of that right now. This is just a cloud-only account, so it's only out in the cloud environment. Okay, so that is how we can create users graphically using the Azure portal. Now let's jump over and look at the Microsoft 365 side of this and see how we can do it there. Okay, so here I am on portal.microsoft.com. We're going to drop down users and click active users, and you're going to notice that if I scroll down, you will see Lucas Paulson, because again, this is all tied back to Azure AD, so it all links to the same place. But let's go ahead, we're going to create a user this way, so we'll click add user. All right, so same kind of thing. It does look a little different now, I will say that, it does look a little different. But you're going to fill out a lot of the same information. All right. One of the complaints that people do have, though, is that there are some features that you'll see in the Azure portal version of this that you won't see in Microsoft 365, and vice versa. There's certain things you'll see in Microsoft 365 portal that you don't see in Azure portal. So it's a little annoying, but you just one of those things you have to get used to. So here we go. I'm going to create a username, Jenny Sampson. Display name, Jenny Sampson. Username is going to be Jenny Sampson. All right. So the name is available. I could have it automatically create a password. Require this user to change password at their first log on, so we could do that, and then send password via email. If we wanted to, we could put an email address in for the user and then have it send it. Okay. So we'll click next. One thing that's unique about this that was different from the Azure way is that the Azure method, we could go over here, we could, with this user, Lucas Paulson, we could assign licenses and all that, but we didn't get the opportunity to assign licenses while we were creating the user. But you'll notice that with doing it through Microsoft 365 method, you do get to assign licenses immediately. Also, one other interesting thing, it forces you to select a location, whereas the Azure portal version of that, you could create the user without actually specifying a location, which means when you go to assign licenses, you could have problems. So that's kind of interesting, but that is something that we get with this. All right. I'm not going to assign a license right now. I'm just going to say create user without product license. I'm going to click next. I'm not going to get into roles. Here's where you specify profile information, so job title, department, all that stuff. And then we would click next and we click finish adding. And then we've now got our user created. All right. And if we want to go through and modify the properties of that user, we can click on the user. All right. So some similarities here, but there's definitely a few things that are different. So I can go through here and anything I want to change, there's a little hyperlink next to it. So it's a little different. You have devices that the user uses, which currently this user has not used any devices. Licenses that have been given, which I didn't give any licenses. Mail, if it's associated with Exchange Online, I have to give a license before this person would get a mailbox in Exchange Online. And then if the user has OneDrive, you'll see that information over here. All right, you could also block sign in for the user. Now, if we jump back over to the Azure portal, let's go to our users there and let's see if this user is showing up in Azure. So click on users, scroll down, and look at there's Jenny Sampson. So we can click on Jenny Sampson and we can modify it the Azure way of doing it. So ultimately, again, the thing to remember here is it's all going to the same place. It's all going to Azure AD. You're just looking at a couple of different ways that the user accounts could be created. All right. And so that is the graphical way that we can create users within Azure and Microsoft 365. I'd now like to look at how we can invite guests to our Azure AD Microsoft 365 environment. It's actually pretty easy. The idea of guest involves you might have somebody that is not part of your organization, yet you would like to invite them to your organization temporarily. Okay, a good example of this is, I think I've told you, you might know this already, I'm a consultant and I've done work with various companies. I actually did a project directly with Microsoft a couple of years ago, and during this project they invited me as a guest to their Azure environment so that I could take part in teams and all of that. And so they sent my email address and invite. I accepted that invite. And then at that point, I had access to utilize the services that they've made available to me. Now, a guest account essentially has the same rights mostly as a regular user. The only difference is that usually we use these things called access reviews in Azure to verify that a guest user still needs access. So they're a little bit more monitored than regular users. They do get to use personal email addresses and all that to authenticate. So they don't get they don't get an email address like the examlabpractice.com one that my users would get. Okay. they get to use their own email address. So I got to use my own email address when I was signing into Microsoft's Azure AD environment. And what happens though is these accounts are more heavily monitored and reviewed, and like you might even schedule what's called an access review to happen every 2 weeks, and all guests have to be verified that they still need access, and if not, they get revoked. So even though I needed access 2 years ago to their Microsoft environment, I'm done with that project, and so I haven't tried to log on, but I'm assuming they probably deactivated my service now, so I can't log on to their environment anymore. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Here I am on portal.azure.com. I'm going to click the menu button here, go to Azure Active Directory. All right, and we're going to, once that pops up, we'll go to Users. And then from there, we're going to click to create a new user, and we'll say Invite External User. So this is what your external user is going to be, a guest user. And so from there, I could specify this person's email address, okay? Like, let's say that this person is a consultant or a contractor. We'll say, let's say Todd Jones at itconsulting.com. All right. So let's say that was a, IT consultant that's going to be working with this. We could set the display name, send an invite message. Hey, Todd, please accept the invite. And I could also, of course, CC myself here, that we're sending this invite. Then I could click next. We could fill out all this information. This user is a guest, not a regular member, right? We could specify a manager if we wanted, emails if we want, specify a usage location because this user will get licenses just like regular users will. When we click assignments, we could add them to a group, add them to a role. Not going to get into the details on that right now, but then I would click review and create. And at that point, I would click invite, which I'm not going to do because there isn't really anybody out there that's going to accept the invite. But all they got to do is accept the invite, and then they can get access to the resources that we give them access to, and we can license this user just like we do other users. Okay. So this happens, and one thing you can do if you are doing this on your end, one thing you can do for fun is try sending your personal email account an invite and invite yourself and try logging on. So that's a little task you can try if you want for some extra credit hands-on. All right. Let's jump over to portal.microsoft.com now. Look at this in the admin center over here. So in the Microsoft 365 side of things, if we drop down the users blade, you're going to see there's a blade called guests. So you would click that blade and you would click add a guest. And at that point, wait on that to load up. Notice what it does. You do it through the portal.microsoft.com and look what it does. It just kicks you back over here into the Azure portal. So invite. So it's the same exact thing, same process, and you fill out the information and you do the invite. Okay. So that is how we can invite guests. I'm not getting into a lot of the details on, monitoring guests, but I will just simply say there is features that are used for heavily monitoring our guest users that can come in handy. In the feature is called access reviews. So we can use what is called access reviews. If I go over to identity governance, you'll see access reviews right here. And then what we can do is we can have guests periodically be checked more often and be watched more often. And then what happens is they can, it sends an email reminder to a certain manager or something every month, and the manager reviews the guest accounts and decides if that person still needs access. So that's one of the things that's a little different than regular users. Yes, you can use access reviews on regular users as well, but guest is one of the major things that we do this on, our guests or external users as they're also referred to. All right, well, hopefully that helps you now understand the concept of guest users. Now on the Microsoft 365 side of things, here on portal.microsoft.com, if we drop down the users blade, we've also got a little feature called contacts, and we can very easily click add a contact and we can add user information here if we want. So If we had a contact for somebody we wanted to stay in touch with, we could add, like, we'll say George Carlson. Email address, we'll say gcarlson9001@gmail.com. Let's say that was the person's email. We could specify profile information, all of that. You can even add mail tip information about this user, and then at that point, or this person, and from that point, we could also even say hide from my organization's global address list. So this would be contacts that only that specific people could locate if they tried to plug it in. If I don't check that though, then it's going to show up for everybody. At that point, I click add. All right, and once that's added, it'll tell you that it could take up to 30 minutes for your change to take effect. It doesn't usually take that long. Let's jump over to Outlook and see if it's already showing up for my users. So if I go over to portal.office.com, all right, and then we'll click on Outlook. Once we get into Outlook, we will go down here. Let's click on right here where it says People. And let's look at all contacts. And there you go. George Carlson is showing up. So that is a user that I could now interact with. Or an email address I could now interact with. I could send an email to that person. So that is how we can create contacts within our Microsoft 365 environment that all of our users can see. One more thing, if I jump back over to the portal.microsoft.com, you'll notice there is an add multiple contacts option. So what you can do is you can download a CSV file with headers or a sample. This is basically like a spreadsheet you could open up if you wanted to. And you could take a look at it. It gives you an example of how you could import users in. So if you had a copy of like a spreadsheet with a bunch of contacts in it, if you formatted it properly, you could just import that in with the help of that CSV option. So this is how you would do it. You would format that spreadsheet, and then you would browse to it, add the contacts, and would import them in. I'd now like to help you understand the concepts of groups in the Azure AD Microsoft 365 environment. Now, I will tell you that groups is definitely one of the features that, even though it all ties back to Azure AD, there are in some cases some different settings that you can configure based on whether or not you're creating it within the Microsoft 365 Admin Center or you're doing it on the Azure side of this, the Azure portal. So we'll start out with the Microsoft 365 Admin Center on portal.microsoft.com. We're going to drop down Teams and Groups. We're then going to click on Active Teams and Groups. And I don't know if you're doing this with me or not, but if you are, you're not going to have the same groups as me, so don't worry about that. But I'm going to click on Add a Group. And then from there, this is the important part. There are 4 different kinds of groups that they make available, although I'll tell you that in the majority of the cases, there are only really 2 kinds of groups that people usually use. They do give you 4 options, and I'll explain these to you here. So probably the most important one to be aware of right now is the one called Microsoft 365 Group. This is you'll notice it is a recommended group. It is the group that can do most anything as far as Microsoft 365 goes. This group is a group where you can group users together, and it's geared towards team collaboration or project collaboration, something along those lines. The other thing about it is it can create a Microsoft team, and anybody who's a member of the group automatically is associated with the team. It can do the same thing with SharePoint. It can create a SharePoint website. It can tie to Microsoft Planner. It's a special type of group that automatically allows for collaboration. So all the different collaboration type services that are available in Microsoft 365, this group will automatically give access to those items for the users that are part of the group. One thing it's also important to know about this group, it gets an email address, okay? It has a shared calendar, which means the users can post stuff on the Microsoft 365 group calendar, and everybody that's in the group can see it. The other thing to be aware of, this group cannot contain devices. So you cannot put devices in this group. It can only contain users. Okay. It is possible, by the way, to put groups in other groups and all that, but as far as devices, it cannot contain devices. It can only contain the users and all that. But then below that, you have what is called distribution group. Okay, now this is a very restricted type of group. This group can contain users, and it gets an email address, but that's about it. It doesn't really have a shared calendar. It doesn't tie to Teams or SharePoint or any of that. If you email the group, the group, everybody in the group will get a copy of the email. So it's strictly for email purposes. All right, you can't give this group any permissions to anything either. The next group is called a mail-enabled security group. This is a group that gets an email address, but it can also be given out permissions to OneDrive and SharePoint. All right, so that's what that's for. It's kind of a hybrid type of group. Now, the last group is a security group. This group does not get an email address associated with it, but it can be given permission to OneDrive and SharePoint. But the most important thing you want to remember about it is that it's used for device management. This is the only group that can support devices. So the thing to remember here is that there's really only two kinds of groups that people really care about most of the time in the Microsoft environment, and that is the Microsoft 365 group and the security group. I'm not saying you can't use these groups, but these are considered more legacy types of groups than they are used by most people these days. All right, so we'll create a Microsoft 365 group. We'll click Next. I'm going to call this group the Admins group. This is going to represent our admins of Microsoft 365. So we could give it a description. We're going to assign an owner. I'm going to make myself the owner. All right, so I will search for myself here, which apparently is being very slow to show up. There we go. And then I'm going to click Add. At that point, it does say that I have a Teams license, so I can be associated with Microsoft Teams. Then I could add members. I'm going to go ahead and just add myself as a member as well. And if I want to add any other users to this, I can, but I'm not going to right now. I'm going to click Next. Give it a email address. I'm going to say admins. It'll check to make sure that that's available. So it is. Is the group public? Public means that users can join this group or this team if you associate with the team. I'm going to say private. I don't want anybody joining it. So as the owner, I can add people to it if I want. Okay. So it is going to create a team if I want it to create a Microsoft team. Then I'm going to click Next and say Create the group. And it's going through the process now of creating the group. All right, now that that's done, I can hit close and the group should show up in the list here. There it is, admins. Now check this out. It does have a team associated with it. So if I actually jump over to portal.office.com and go to, this is again the user portal. If I open up Microsoft Teams, I should see that the team is there. And anybody, of course, that is a member of this would have this team available. And there it is right there. So as a user, I could start a conversation with any other admins that are part of this. And this is a private group, so only members of the group would actually see it. All right. So that is how we can create a group. The other thing I will tell you here is that you're going to notice that it says membership type is assigned. So the group type says assigned. Now you may not know what that exactly means yet, but you're about to. I'm about to explain it. And the thing that's important of note here is that with this group, it being what's called an assigned group, there is no option here to switch it to anything other than an assigned group. An assigned group essentially is a group that people can be a member of only if somebody manually puts them in the group, like the group owner. So unless it's a public group and people can request to join it if they want, but it's manual. Now there is a type of group called a dynamic group, which you cannot create through here, at least not at the recording of this video, and who knows when Microsoft might change that. But essentially you have to do this through Azure. So it's time for us to jump over to the Azure side and look at how things are a little different on the Azure side. So let's go over to portal.azure.com. I'm going to click the menu button and go to Azure Active Directory, and then we're going to click on groups, and you're going to see that I have the same groups over here because, again, all of this ties to Azure AD. So there's the admins group right there, although there is a few other groups here that I've created separately in some of my various other courses that I've built that are strictly for Azure, which I'm not getting into that concept right now, but these are groups that I'll say in a nutshell, they get synchronized from on-premise, and those aren't showing up on the Microsoft 365 side right now, but not getting into all that. Anyway, there's the admins group. It's an assigned group. All right, and I can control the membership and all of that through here if I want, see the properties of it, and notice that I can switch right here to dynamic user group by clicking this. But I want to create a group this time, and I want to show you something a little different. So looking at groups, if I click new group, I want you to notice that it will give me just 2 options. So I don't have the 4 options that you saw on the Microsoft 365 side of this, and that's the thing I wanted to kind of point out, is that things are a little different on the Azure side. There's different options. There's, in some cases, less options, but some cases more options. For example, there's less group types I can choose from, but when I choose a group type, I can choose to assign it as assign or dynamic or not. Now, I will say with the Microsoft 365 group, you get an option, you just get dynamic user, but with security groups, you get dynamic user and dynamic device because of the fact that it can essentially be associated with devices as well, okay, which is really neat. So one of the cool things that we can do here when we create a group is, like with Microsoft 365, let's just specify this, we'll just call it the finance group, and it can get an email address, and then I can go down here and I can choose dynamic user, and then I can choose an owner, okay, which is fine, but with dynamic groups, you're not going to be adding users to the group using a dynamic group. You're going to use a query to do that. So let's look at that. So what we can do with a dynamic group is we can specify these queries that will be performed. So every time you do anything involving a user, if you modify a user's attribute or anything, it will, Azure AD will run a query against it, and if it matches these rules, it'll put the user in the group. Or it could remove the user from the group if it no longer matches. So watch this. I'm going to go to properties. So here's all the properties of a user. Let's do, how about department? And we'll say contains the word finance. It doesn't matter if you use uppercase or lowercase. It's not case sensitive. So that's one expression. Let's add another expression, and we'll do or. How about the job title contains the word finance? Okay, so we'll do that. So either one of those, and you're gonna be part of the group. So we'll hit save. All right, we've created our query. We'll click create, and we're gonna let that little group get created. Now let's jump over to users here. Let's click on users. And I'm going to go down to a user. Let's find Lucas Paulson here. And I am going to edit his properties. And let's see. Let's set the job title to Finance Officer. And he's part of the Finance Department, we'll say. Okay, so we'll hit save. Now keep in mind this does take a little time sometimes to take effect. All right, we're going to go back over to groups. All right, and we will scroll down to finance, and we will look at members, and we'll give this just a second. Okay, and I had paused the recording for about 2 minutes and then hit refresh, and as you can see, Lucas Paulson is now showing up. So it just shows you that, you know, this does work, but it does take a few minutes, you know, a couple minutes at least to let it take effect. Now, let's jump back over to portal.microsoft.com and let's refresh the groups over here, and you can see finance is created, but I want you to notice something. It did not create a team with this. So unfortunately, when you create groups on the Azure side of things, at least at the creation of this video, they don't just automatically create a team for you, unfortunately. So you know, it is one of those things where you know, you can still create that Microsoft 365 group and all that, but you can come back in here and click add teams if you want. All right, so you can totally do that and create a team that way. All right. All right, well, hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the different kinds of groups and how we can create the groups. I'd like to spend some time now talking a little bit about the different subscription types that we have available with us in regards to Microsoft 365, Office 365, and making sure that we can evaluate those for our company. It's important to have a decent understanding of what's out there if you're going to be the decision maker in an organization on what subscription types that you're going to purchase. So the first thing we'll look at is, and we're going to this is going to be geared towards the business side of things as opposed to like the home subscriptions for Office and Microsoft 365. But if you go out to a search engine like Google and just search for Microsoft 365 Business, just search that, you're going to see there's an article Microsoft has that breaks all this down for you. So we're going to click this little link here, and we're now going to go to see plans and pricing. Now, you may say, well, why didn't you create a slide for this and show us a slide for the breakdown? The reason is because it's important for you to see the most up-to-date information, and where better to get the most up-to-date information on what the pricing is and the plans than to actually go there and look at Microsoft's table. They actually have a table for you that's been set up that breaks all this down for you. So as you can see right here, I'm looking at Microsoft 365 Business Basic, Business Standard, Business Premium. Now, their business editions of Microsoft 365 are geared towards 300 user or less environments. Okay, so that's what these are built for. And so if you look right here, you've got a monthly fee of $5, $12.50, $20, and of course I'm going off of United States pricing, so you'd have to, if you're in a different country, you need to look at the pricing based on where you're at. But you can get this latest and greatest information off their site, and you can get a breakdown of what you get. Okay, so if we look here with Basic, we're getting the web app, mobile versions of Office apps. Okay, we can expand that out. We can look at exactly what we're getting. They tell you web versions of Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, always up to date. You get the mobile versions, collaborate using real-time authoring. Mobile users can work in the same document on the same document at the same time. These are all these things you're getting all that with all three of these. Email and calendar options. So hosting, they tell you 50 gig mailboxes. You can set up a custom domain. So instead of like examlabpractice.onmicrosoft.com, I can just be examlabpractice.com. I can have my email address associated with it. Okay, business class email, the ability to manage, calendar, share, available meeting times, all that, scheduling meetings. So a bunch of great features here that's included with email and calendar. All three of these are going to give you that. Okay, main thing there is remember you have a 50 gig limit on mailbox. So file and storage. As you can see, you get the 1 terabyte of OneDrive cloud storage, OneDrive for Business. You get access to SharePoint, the ability to share external files with people, the ability to securely share documents and set permissions, as well as synchronizing with your files between your Mac and mobile devices. So a lot of good stuff there. We have teamwork, communications. So all three of these have the ability to host online meetings with the help of Teams, 250 users, calls up for 250 users essentially. The ability to chat, bring together team and collaborate, share files, set up team sites, contents, all that great stuff. So that's sort of moving into the Microsoft Teams world. That's the things you get with it though. You have security and compliance, so all this great security capabilities. You have what's called Exchange Online Protection. They mention that you have international, regional, industry-specific standards in terms of setting up security and privacy controls. You can control who can access your information through permissions, set password policies, all that good stuff. Password reset for your users, all that good stuff with all three of these. Support and documents. Support and deployment, sorry. So access support on the phone, the web, anytime. They tell you have peace of mind. We have a 3.9 uptime guarantee. So that is actually Microsoft's SLA. Microsoft's SLA for this is a 3.9 availability. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, if you actually look at the term high availability and go to like Wikipedia's article on it, for example, you're going to find that a 3.9 rating, if you look, they've got a table. A 3.9 availability means that they guarantee you their service won't be down for more than 1.4 minutes a day, 10 minutes a week, 43 minutes a month, which that's really what you want to look at is the monthly time period, and then 8.7 hours a year. So that's what a 3.9 SLA is going to basically provide you with. Okay, so it's important to understand what you're getting. Also, if you discover that they are down more than they say they are, they're actually going to provide you with more Azure credit, essentially, subscription time and all that. So you're getting all that out of it. Again, now this is key here. This is important. 300 users is the maximum number of users for all three of these plans. So if you're going to go beyond that, you got to move into the enterprise world. Okay, so you start getting into the, E5, E3 subscriptions, all that. Right here, tools to build and manage your business. So if you scroll back up here and we look, we have the basic plan. You'll notice basic does give you the plan, schedule, and daily tasks with Microsoft Teams, but you don't get these other two things. So you have to have at least the standard in order to get these other two. So it says make it easier for your customers to schedule and manage appointments for Microsoft bookings, have real-time accurate mileage tracking reporting, palm of your hand with the Mile IQ. So those are all the things you're getting out of that. Then you have desktop versions, so fully and always up-to-date versions of Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all that. So these are your desktop versions of the apps available for your PC. Notice that you do not get that with Basic. You do not get that with the Basic plan. So you have to have at least the standard or premium in order to get that, right? All right. So they all allow you to install the Office apps on up to 5 devices, 5 PCs and Macs. All right. Okay, so when you get into the Premium Edition, that's where you're going to get the advanced security capabilities. So you get a bunch of other capabilities involving security. You get something called Office 365 ATP Advanced Threat Protection. This is going to really drill down on making sure links are safe via email and there's attachments are safe. You get additional capabilities as far as security goes. You get remote wipe capabilities on machines. You can restrict copying and saving of files and information, control access to company information, and allow no forwarding capabilities if you want. You can apply policies in case a threat does occur, some kind of a security breach. You also get a thing with that known as Windows Defender Exploit Guard for protecting it against exploits. You have extra malware protection, as you can see here, and also they tell you have enable unlimited cloud archive and long-term preservation policy to basically allow your users to save emails forever if they want in certain circumstances. So online archiving essentially. And then lastly, you get device management with that. So that's where you get into being able to manage your Apple devices, Android devices, Windows devices as well, and control those using some very restrictive policies. And this is where you start moving into the MDM, mobile device management, mobile application management, which is Microsoft's Intune product. Okay, so those are the things you're going to get with the business side of things. All right, so it's important to understand, what you're getting with the business side of things. You got that 300 max limit though. Okay. So the next thing would be to take a look at the enterprise side of things. So to do that, I am going to go and I'm going to search for Microsoft 365. We'll say we'll just say E3, E5, and you'll find your information there. So compare Microsoft 365 enterprise plans. So let's look at that article now. Okay, so we'll go there. And we have the same kind of breakdown. So you can see that they're really pushing three main subscription types here. The E5 Enterprise 3, E3, which is Enterprise 3, E5 Enterprise 5, and then you've got F3. That's first line workers, okay? And so, of course, these are the two big plans that they're always trying to push. Now, first line workers is going to be available for people who are in a first line worker type of environment, and you'll notice it's much cheaper, but we'll see what the differences are. So if we go down here, you can break this all down. You'll see that they have the Microsoft 365 apps, so the ability to get access to your PowerPoint, Word, Excel, all that. I can expand this out and see exactly what I'm getting. All right, there are a few terms in regards to what first line workers have, okay, and if you want additional information, you can go to their link on that. They all three have access to the Office mobile apps and Office for the web. They used to call this Office Online. They changed the name, and they're now calling it Microsoft 365 Apps, or sometimes they'll call it Apps for Enterprise. That used to be called Office 365 Pro Plus. So just know that their terminology here has recently changed. Then you have email calendar capabilities. So Outlook, Exchange, ability to use bookings. You can see what first line workers don't have. Voice and meeting capabilities with Teams. Okay, notice that with E5 you can do audio calls. You get access to what's called the phone system with Teams. So you can actually use like voice over IP in regards to Teams, hooking into the public switch telephone network and all of that. All right, so then you have social and intranet, so SharePoint, Yammer. You notice they've each got that, although there was a couple of terms in regards to what first line workers have. You have files, content, so they've all got that. So OneDrive for Business, Microsoft List, Stream, Sway, task management capabilities, Power Apps, Power Automate, Planner, To Do, so they get all of that. And then you get to Advanced Analytics. So with Advanced Analytics, you'll notice first line doesn't have any of that. And then you'll notice that with E3, we have My Analytics, but we don't have Power BI, which is incredibly powerful as far as grabbing analytics, very advanced, and generating advanced reports and all of that. So we don't have that. The only one we got that with is E5. All right. So then device management, that gets back over into being able to manage our devices. So we can manage Windows Enterprise. We have the Microsoft 365 Admin Center for managing some of our devices, but mostly the most important thing we're going to get the ability to use is Microsoft Intune, which that is extremely powerful as far as managing mobile device management, mobile application management, all that good stuff. We can even do autopilot, which is a way of having Windows 10 machines boot up when you first buy a Windows 10 computer, and it just automatically gets managed by our Intune environment and controlled through our Intune environment. So that's an incredibly, I'm not going to really get deep into Intune and all that stuff right now, but that's an incredibly powerful capability. You have Endpoint Configuration Manager as well, which Endpoint Configuration Manager it used to be called SCCM, System Center Configuration Manager. They renamed it, and Endpoint Config Manager is actually works in conjunction with Intune as well. Intune being more geared towards the mobile side of things, Endpoint Configuration being manager being more geared towards the on-premise side of things. So then I've got all this identity and access management. You can see that I have Windows Hello, Credential Guard, so that gets into the authentication, biometric, facial recognition, all of that stuff. Azure Active Directory Premium 1. So I get the Premium 1 of Azure Active Directory with my E3, E5 has it, and then first line. But Premium 2 only comes with the E5. And then the threat protection. And by the way, just as a side note, if you want to dig into what you get with Azure AD P1 and P2, that Microsoft has a great article for that as well. To search Azure AD P1 versus P2, and there's a pricing here, and you can really dig into what you're going to get based on the different premiums. So here's all the things. So you'll notice there's 4 different versions of Azure AD. That's the directory services that we've got, right? So you can kind of dig in and see what you get with each one. Okay, not really getting deep into that right now though. I just wanted to point that out if you want to look at that little document. Okay. So then from here, I have advanced threat protection. So you'll notice that E5 is the only one that has that. The advanced threat protection is extremely powerful security capabilities as far as like monitoring your email and safe links and safe attachments. You heard me mention a little bit of that with the business side just a minute ago. All right. So then information protection capabilities. I have data loss prevention. All right. Making sure that we don't have any leakage of data. In other words, people sharing documents and things with people they shouldn't be. We have Windows information protection and BitLocker protection. That's an additional layer of security for Windows. Azure information protection, that's going to get into the ability to classify data, add sensitivity labels to data. So we have P1. Essentially, we have P1 and P2. Only E5 has P2. In a nutshell, with P2, you can automatically classify data. But with P1, users have to manually classify data. So in a nutshell, essentially what I'm saying is I could have a document where if it has somebody's credit card number in the document, I could have that classified as a sensitive document automatically if I have the P2. But with P1, users have to manually classify it. So that's sort of your difference. You've also got Cloud App Security. Cloud App Security is a what's known as a security broker. It's something that can monitor all the applications users are using on the web in your environment and give you reports to see who's going to what web apps. So if I want to know how many people are using Dropbox instead of OneDrive for Business, I could. Not getting into a lot of detail on this right now, though. And then security management. So I have a secure score. I can see what my rating is in my organization, see how secure my organization is from a cloud perspective. I have Microsoft Security and Compliance Center, which is going to also give me the ability to look at all the security policies and stuff in my environment all in one place, and also see if my machines are actually compliant. All right, and then lastly, we have advanced compliance, which gets into even more compliance capabilities. I can use e-discovery. I have what's called a customer lockbox where I can secure my encryption key information and all that. And by the way, e-discovery is where I can do forensics. So if I'm doing an investigation on a user, I can do all of that. I have privileged identity management, privileged access management, which gets into controlling who gets access to certain information for a temporary amount of time, all that good stuff. So hopefully that gives you guys now a little bit of decent breakdown of this. I highly recommend, though, you pull these up yourself and just kind of read through, and it'll really help you. Sitting down and watching the video here is obviously going to help you, but sitting down too and kind of reading through it yourself will help you wrap your brain around it. So this is why I didn't want to just create a slide with a table, because there's so much information here, and you can get the most up-to-date and most accurate information if you go out there and look at it directly on Microsoft's website yourself. Now, in regards to managing, configuring our subscriptions in the Microsoft 365 world, it's important to know where all this is going to happen and how we can configure the options that are available to us. So here we are in portal.microsoft.com, or also known as admin.microsoft.com. And from there, I can drop down right here where it says billing. Okay. And a couple of things I can look at here. Number one, I can look at licenses. So if I click on licenses here, this is going to pop up what exact licenses that are available based on my subscription. All right, and as you can see, I have the Enterprise Mobility plus Security E5, and I have the Office 365 E5. Okay, which are these are the main two that I have. These are the two you should have. Some of my lessons that I show you, I may have some other licenses, but these are the main two licenses that we'll need in order for us to kind of practice and play around with all this stuff. So as you can see, I can click on each one of these, and it shows me how many of these licenses are available. And if I wanted to assign a license to a user, for example, right now I could say assign a license. Okay. And that would allow me to assign a license to a particular user. Okay. Of course, you can also assign licenses to users directly on the user itself, or when you create the user if you want. Okay. But that's how many licenses I've got, right? You can also click on Manage Purchases if you want to see your products. But I want to look at Purchase Services here. So let's click on Purchase Services. And right here, we can really look at all the different options that are available to us, right? So right here, we have Microsoft 365, and here are the Microsoft 365 Business Premium. They tell you month to month. So different billing options that are available to us we can go with. You can look through these different billing options and some of the different things that you got, right? At that point, I also have Office 365. So there's Office 365 E5. Same thing. I have different payment options here that I can go with. You have the business apps available to you. And keep in mind, you can always click details on any one of these, and you can see details on what you get. And it kind of gives you a breakdown, kind of like the website does. Although I like to look at it from the website standpoint. It gives me a good, more detailed breakdown than this does in some cases. But you can see what you're going to get. You can see what it's going to cost you. They tell you what the yearly plan is as well on that. All right, let me go back over here to Purchase Services. You can also, if you want, you can say to show me all, in this case 23. So I can scroll down now and I can see everything listed out here for Microsoft 365 if I want. All right. The other thing that's really cool about this is I can go through and compare. If I want to compare some of the things that I'm looking at here. So for example, if I wanted to compare, let's do E5, E3. I can say compare. Come up here to the top and click on compare your products. It'll let you add 3 different products there that you can go with. All right. So it's going to go ahead now. It's going to create a comparison. And as you can see, I now have a nice little breakdown. And that's something that you didn't really get out of the website that's kind of cool, is the ability to go through here and compare. Okay. So this is a great way for you to sort of evaluate what you got. And as far as being able to configure your subscription, you can go to your products and see what you've got, see what your licenses are, and you have the ability to assign licenses. Although I'll talk more about assigning licenses, but this is just in this regards, it's just looking to see what you get. Another thing too is, we looked at Office 365 E5. The Office 365 E5 gives us the Office products and all that. One thing you can do though that's kind of cool about this is you can see this information here, and you can see how it licenses out and all of that. But you can also, another way of doing this is to jump over to the Azure portal. So if you actually let's go to portal.azure.com, as I like the way that this kind of shows you everything as well. And you can click the little menu bar here and then go down to Azure Active Directory. And then we're going to click on Licenses. So we'll go to Licenses. All right. And then from there, I can click All Products, and you can see the same 2 licenses we just saw. Okay. So I'm going to click on Office 365 E5, and then I'm going to click on Service Plan Details. And so notice that this kind of just breaks it down for me and tells me the different products that I'm getting out of the Office 365 E5 plan in this case. So here's all these things that I can assign to my users if I want. All right. Now, if I assign the whole entire license, they're going to get all of this, but I can actually enable, disable different things maybe that maybe I don't want the user to have. Let's take a look real quick at the EMS subscription. So let's go back to licenses, and then let's click on Enterprise Mobility plus Security. This is a package that's full of security capabilities that you get with your Office, Microsoft 365, Office 365. So let's go to Service Plan Details, and here's all the things that I'm going to get with that subscription. So Azure AD Premium 1 and 2, ATP Advanced Threat Protection, Information Protection Premium 1 and 2, Azure Rights Management, Azure Multi-Factor Authentication, Cloud App Security Intune, all that. Keep in mind, we're going to go into more detail on a lot of this stuff as we move along, but this gives you a breakdown of what you're getting out of that. So it's important to understand what we've got with our subscription plans, as well as being able to look at some of the other plans that we could purchase. All right. So hopefully that gives you a good breakdown between the two, looking at the Microsoft 365 portal, the Azure portal, and kind of seeing what we've got. Mostly though, if you really want to compare things, you're gonna have to do that over here on the Microsoft 365 side of things. I now want to get into managing users in bulk, like bulk creation and all of that. So this can be done pretty easily. Let me show you a little bit about how we can do it. I'm going to go here on portal.azure.com. I'm going to click the menu button. We're going to go down to Azure Active Directory. Okay, we're going to click on Users. And then at that point, you'll notice that there is an option here called Bulk Operations. So I can bulk create users, I can bulk invite guests, or I can bulk delete. So we're going to click Bulk Create. And we're going to download this little CSV spreadsheet. Okay, and I'm going to open that spreadsheet. I'm going to open that up using Excel. All right, here's what it looks like. And they give an example of creating some users. Okay, like they're showing you how to create a user named Chris Green, giving you an example of that. I'm going to create a user named Beth Donaldson. Okay, username will be Beth Donaldson at examlabpractice.com, and then password, I'll just do this as my password. All right, and then block sign in no, first name Beth, last name Donaldson. Job title will say finance manager, finance department. You could specify usage location, so on and so forth. I'm not going to fill all these out, but we'll leave it at that. And then let's delete Chris Green. We're going to create another user, and I'll call this username Jack Carlson. Username Jack Carlson at examlabpractice.com. Got to make sure I don't typo any of that. Temporary password, block sign in, put in the first and last name. Okay, and then maybe Jack Carlson is part of IT. Okay, so we'll say IT admin. All right, we'll just leave it at that. So then we've now got our users, and what I'm now going to do is I'm going to save this and we'll upload it to Azure. Okay, so I saved it in Excel, and then I just selected it here by clicking the folder icon, and now I'm going to click to submit, and this will take just a moment, but hopefully it will create our 2 users for us. All right, it says it succeeded, so we're going to close out of that, and let's refresh and see if our users are there. There's Beth Donaldson, so you can see that Beth was created, and then let's see if Jack Carlson. So there's Jack Carlson. So as you can see, this could definitely come in handy in a situation where your company was hiring a bunch of people and the HR department gave you a spreadsheet full of people, or maybe you work for like a university or college and you have like a enrollment period where the enrollment people give you a spreadsheet with a bunch of users. You could format it correctly and then import this in. All right, let's jump over to portal.microsoft.com and look at its side of all this. So we'll click on users. We're going to click on active users, and then right here it says add multiple users. So you'll notice that you have the ability to type in user information right here and create users this way. You can add more roles if you want. It says you can enter up to 249 users with temporary passwords. The other thing is you can also upload a CSV file here as well. So this is just another way to go about it. They even have a nice little video you can watch on that if you want. So pretty straightforward as far as adding users to our, through the graphical tool. Now the last thing I want to show you is how we could create users in PowerShell, and as well as if we wanted to import a CSV file. If you go to Google or Bing and do a quick search on create Microsoft 365 user accounts with PowerShell, you can find this little article right here. And they tell you the process of doing this. Now, the first thing that they tell you is that you need to connect to your Microsoft 365 tenant from within PowerShell. And we will take a look at how we can do that. If we go right here, I'm in PowerShell, and of course you can get into PowerShell with your operating system by right-clicking the Start button and going to Terminal or PowerShell, depending on what operating system you've got. But it's going to bring you into PowerShell regardless. And then the first thing I need to do is I got to make sure that I have the commands that are needed for this. And I can check to see if I have the commands by typing get-command space dash noun star MSOL star. That's going to show me if I got the commands, and I don't. So I'm going to type install dash module MS online, and I'm going to hit enter. All right. So this is going to allow me to download and install the Microsoft 365 commands that I'm going to need in order to utilize PowerShell. Okay. Or utilize PowerShell commands to create a user. So first thing, if this is the first time you've ever done this, it will ask you to install something called NuGet, which is a downloader package that's used for PowerShell. I've actually already got it, so it did not ask that question, but I would normally just hit yes to that and hit enter. Now, the other thing it's going to say is that this is downloading from an untrusted repository. Am I sure that I want to download this? Now, why is it downloading from an untrusted repository? Well, it's downloading from something called PowerShell Gallery, which is a gallery of PowerShell commands that is owned by Microsoft, but it is also open to the community. So people that are not necessarily working for Microsoft can upload new commands to PowerShell, to the PowerShell Gallery. The good news is they do have moderators that are checking to make sure that people aren't creating commands that do damage. But anyway, for the most part, even though it says it's an untrusted repository, I'm going to say yes to that because I do trust it, and it's installing those commands right now, and it looks like it's done. So now, if I hit the up arrow a couple of times, I should be able to type the get command dash noun and start MSOL star, and we should see that the MSOL commandlets are going to show up. Okay, so here they are. As you can see, they are showing up. And there is a command, if I scroll up, there is a command called get MSOL user. So if I type that command, get MSOL user, and I hit enter, okay, it's going to try to connect to my Azure Active Directory service and show me, but then it tells you there's a problem. It says you got to connect to your MSOL service before you can do this. So we're going to type connect dash MSOL service. We're going to hit enter, and it's going to allow us to authenticate to the Microsoft 365 and Azure AD service, and at that point we should be able to run the commands. All right, so here it is popping up the sign-in box, and then I'm going to put in my credentials. All right, and at that point, if everything went smoothly, I should get just a prompt. Okay, so now I'm going to type get-msol user. I'm going to hit enter, and there we go. It's displaying my users, including my most recent users that I've created, Beth Donaldson, and then the Jack Carlson user. All that's been created. Okay, let's say I want to create a user. There is a command called new-msol user that I can run. Okay, and if we actually go back over to that article that I had pulled up, you can see the command right here. I can copy it actually, and then I should just be able to right click and it'll paste it in there. And you don't have to necessarily use all of it, but I'll just use this part of it. These are the required pieces of it. So then I'll just change out a couple things. So let's create a user, and I'll call this user Alice. Actually, let's do this. Alice Peterson. All right. First name Alice, last name Peterson, and then the user principal name, which is going to be basically the email address type name. So we'll say Alice Peterson at examlabpractice.com, and I'm going to hit enter. And all right, it created the user, and it also created a temporary password. All right, and I should be able to type get msol user and see that that user has been created. Okay, so there it is, Alice Peterson. In fact, I also should be able to jump back over here and go to active users, and we should see that that user is showing up in the graphical here as well. There it is, Alice Peterson. It would show up in Azure AD on the Azure portal side as well. Okay. The last thing I'll point out is that on this document, they also tell you that you can create multiple users by using a CSV file. So you could create that same CSV file that you saw me use a minute ago, and you can use this little import-csv command, and you can actually import it. It'll create the accounts that way. So those are going to be the ways that we can utilize the creation of users for bulk creation. Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.